Welcome back, Camden Catholic. Oh, man. Sorry if there's like a little bit of an echo in here, but I'm currently hiding inside of the choir room in Mr. Gardner's space right now, simply because I got a couple people in my room right now taking care of some stuff. But let's pick up where we left off in class today, right? We told a really weird story about this guy, Philip. Don't be creeped out by it. It is what it is, all right? Now, that account, though, of that story was actually written down by Aristotle. So we don't know for sure if it actually happened that way, but we like to believe that it did. So Philip wants to conquer Persia following the successful conquering of Athens and Sparta and their leagues, right? So what you need to write down really quick is Philip successfully conquered the Peloponnesian League, the Delian League, and he's now looking to go after Persia, right? He does this by using the phalanx system, right? Having a very well-trained military, a very large military at that. And remember, they actually hailed from Macedonia. So they actually had a large amount of people that hadn't been used for any kind of warlike activity up to this point. But Philip II, though, unfortunately, is going to die at his daughter's wedding because he gets stabbed to death by his bodyguard, right? Even though the bodyguard tripped on a vine and got caught and also got stabbed to death. So anyway, but let's keep getting after it, okay? Now, one of his 7 wives, Olympias, which I told you a really funny story in class about her today too, and it's just really, all right, Zeus, he's up to some stuff. All right, anyway, one of his 7 wives, Olympias, right, actually outmaneuvers the other wives and places her child, Alexander, on the throne, right? So that's actually how Alexander ascended to the Macedonian throne, right? So the thing about it is Alexander at the time was about the age of 18 when all this went down. And he held on to all of Greece by himself, okay? So when he turned 20, he actually gathered an army large enough and men and ships from across all of Greece, and he wanted to cross the Aegean and attempt to conquer the Persian Empire, which at the time stretched 2,000 miles from Egypt all the way to India. Absolutely enormous. Absolutely ridiculously big. Also, from what the accounts that I can tell, from after learning from Aristotle about proper government practice and how to be a good leader and stuff, most of the people that were actually underneath Alexander's rule were very, very happy to be underneath his rule. They were tired of the warring factions between Sparta and Athens, and Alexander gave them an identity, a united identity of Greek, right? As Greeks together instead of Greeks against one another. So anyway, continuing forward, he was also a phenomenal military leader. But his job was a little bit pretty much like halfway done for him due to the fact that Persia was super weak due to a lot of weak rulers, right? However, Alexander is going to battle his way over 300 different times and actually move all the way through and conquer the entire Persian Empire. He does this very swiftly, right? And here's a map of his movements, actually. All the little stars are major battles, right? Huge, huge battles. And really quick, when you're looking at this, you're like, how is it possible that this little place right here went and just went and just went through the entire area? Now, keep in mind, the Persian Empire was so big that a lot of your space between these areas is just kind of like farmland and untouched and uncivilized land. So he actually just went one city-state at a time, right? So, and actually successfully did it. One of the coolest campaigns is the one that he actually had outside of Egypt, because he actually moved through this area of modern-day Turkey, went all the way down, all the way through modern-day Israel, and then around through Egypt and came back again, right? So the crazy thing that happened outside of Egypt, he actually, Cairo, Egypt, was actually, or not Cairo, Egypt, actually, take that back, okay? There's a city to this day now north of Memphis, Egypt, right, that is actually called Alexandria. And the reason why that happened is because when they renamed the city after him, and it was the capital of the entire area, because he was apparently such a phenomenal military general. What apparently had happened is, remember, Egypt's a desert, right? So while they were actually trying to storm and take over Egypt, they were stuck out in the desert, and they were running out of water. And all of the men of Alexander's army went around from man to man, to canteen, and they were like, well, spare what you have. Give me as much water as you can. And they amassed 1 cupful of water. And they handed it to Alexander, and they were like, sir, drink this. We know you're thirsty. Drink this. And what he does with the water, he takes it, and he dumps it out in the sand. He's like, you don't drink, I don't drink. And they were like, oh my God, I'll die for you. And then they just went and wrecked house. So that's a very an old school story about Alexander and his military strategies. Also, apparently, he smelt phenomenal. Legend goes that apparently when he sweat, he smelt like roses. Now, anyway, Alexander never once lost a battle in his campaign across Persia, even against soldiers that were actually mounted on war elephants outside of India, right? So one of my professors in college, I've never bothered to go and look this up before actually, tells me, he's like, well, when you attack a war elephant, Alexander was one of the first ones to figure out that if you just need to dislodge the driver, that the elephants are docile by nature. So he said aim for the drivers up here, right? So anyway, but continuing forward, before setting out again, though, even though a lot of historians say they don't really know where Alexander would have gone next, due to the fact that the Himalayan mountains separated India from the Persian Empire, that the steppe separated Mongolia and China and this huge region of Tibet, he was kind of geographically isolated. There was no really where else for him to go out and set out to go. But what ended up happening is we believe that he actually unexpectedly died from a sudden fever. Some people will claim that it's possibly from syphilis because of, like, he had multiple wives. He had 3 wives, actually. One of them's name was Phyllis. And he actually is going to, when he's in his deathbed and he's just sitting there dying from this fever, they go, Alexander, sir, who should lead your empire? Who should lead your empire? We don't know what to do. And he said, leave it to the best. And then he died, right? And so they actually gave it to his 3 leading generals. Now, over the next 300 years, though, the empire actually began to fall apart and get smaller and smaller because different men were actually battling for control. More than likely, Alexander would have never done that had he been of right mind. But the story goes is that he actually died from this fever, and this, like, the hysteria of the entire thing set up battles for control, right? Now, underneath this era, though, of Greece under the one culture of Alexander, it's called the Hellenistic age, right? And that's the most important part. Alexander the Great was a phenomenal human and a very cool person to study. But the Hellenistic period, the thing that happened following his death before the empire began to crumble, is one of the most amazing architectural and artistic and scientific achievements that the world's ever seen. Because Greece, Persia, Egypt, and Indian cultures all began to blend together and to create this golden age. And what's that blending called? Very nice job, Mara. I heard you over there. Cultural diffusion, right? So all these cultures diffused together and created a very, very intelligent place, a bedrock and a hotbed for intelligence, right? So Alexandria, Egypt, became the capital of this new huge empire, which is actually north of Memphis in the Nile Delta area. Boasted everything that you could possibly ever want. It was like the grand bazaar, right? Everything, Greek marble all the way to Arabic spices, right? The things, and it was home to over 1 million people. Like during this time period, 1 million people is an absolutely massive, massive city, all right? Due to the fact that, like, when Mansa Musa during the Middle Ages was traveling through most of these different places, they only had maybe 100,000 people in each, like, town. Cairo and Mansa Musa, the richest man in all of history, an African man, traveled through Cairo, Egypt at the time following the death of Alexander's empire. They only had about 100,000 people, and Mansa Musa brought with him 60,000 people on a huge pilgrimage. So just to give you an idea of how small these areas were, 1 million people is humongous. It's absolutely huge. Now, some of the cool stuff that you can see culturally diffusion-wise is this is actually an example of, like, the Hellenistic period in Egypt, right? So these are, of course, sarcophagus. Very, very nice, Joey. I heard you, bud. Sarcophagus are actually the things that house mummies and mummified bodies. And who's invading my space right now? Who is that? That's Mr. Gardner. Now, the second faculty member to appear in a flip. Now, anyway, but this is sarcophagus. Inside of it's a mummified body. Ironically enough, what's wrong with this person's face? I heard somebody. That's right, Nigel. I like where your head's at. And I'm just like, wait a minute. Egyptians, they're African, right? They're North African. They would have much darker skin. And he's right. This is a Greek person, right? So the Greeks actually began to take the ideas of mummification and embalming away from the Egyptians, and they actually began to be buried much like Egyptians. This is a fully Greek mummy. It's very, very cool. So anyway, it actually looks just like the senior that graduated last year named Julius Romero. Now, anyway, so really, really fun fact too. Women under the Hellenistic period were revered and became poets, philosophers, even rulers. Alexander broke away from that old ancient Athens Greek model of being like, oh, women, you have to hide behind everything. Not in the Hellenistic period, you don't. In the Hellenistic period, women were allowed to be leaders. That right there, it's Cleopatra VII, the main squeeze of Julius Caesar. The story goes that it was actually Mark Antony, but Mark Antony actually wasn't even into Cleopatra as much as Julius was, and apparently Julius Caesar dated Cleopatra, but the Romans didn't like her because she wasn't Roman. So anyway, now, going forward, though, in the Hellenistic Empire, they're going to do things like map the solar system, right? They're going to come up with 2 different models. See, like some of the earliest, most genius minds, like Hippocrates and I think his name Herodotus is going to actually become a historian. Write his name down: Herodotus. Herodotus, right? His works are going to become like a modern day history text. These guys right here from the eyes of Ptolemy, Ptolemy, are going to like begin to map the solar system. They're going to look to the heavens. They're going to be like, oh, wait, is the sun in the middle of the universe? Is the earth in the middle of the universe? So they actually came up with both models. The heliocentric model is the sun-centered universe, and the geocentric model is the earth-centered universe, right? This is a very, very famous sculpture from the Hellenistic period as well. It's known as the Venus de Milo. So you've got huge leaps forward in art and things like that. Now, one of the biggest thinkers that actually came out of the Hellenistic period is a guy by the name of Archimedes, right? Archimedes is the inventor of the Hellenistic period, right? He invented the Archimedes screw, which is actually the first well. Theories on density. One of the best stories about the Hellenistic period is Archimedes actually apparently sat down in his bathtub and he saw the water actually rise up and he saw items floating on top of it. He's like, wait, why do I sink sometimes and don't the others, right? So he figured out that water is displaced by a body at rest. And so he was like, Eureka! And he apparently jumped out of his bathrobe and then ran through the streets of Alexandria naked going, Eureka, Eureka, I have an idea. And so he also apparently came up with a heat ray, which is another whole thing. A lot of the Mythbusters proved it wasn't real. But and then a bunch of math junk, too. Now, anyway, the heat ray was actually really, really neat because apparently it took, like, it was a concaved mirror that focused all the rays of sunlight onto a focal point and apparently could roast ships in the harbor, right? Probably not true. And that's the Archimedes screw. It actually raised water from one lower point to a higher one. And that's it, all right? Very, very good job. I'm very, very impressed with everything you guys have been doing. And we will pick this up again a little bit tomorrow when we start your study guide. All right, so I will see you guys then. Have a great evening, Camden Catholic.